Excellent. All right, we are live on YouTube for the first time ever, and this is strange. Let's see if anyone shows up. And we're going to be talking about some last-minute exam advice for the VCE economics exam, which starts in just over 4 hours, just under 4.5 hours, really, which is a little bit terrifying. I'm pretty anxious about it. I hope that's a harder exam than the past couple of years, because the last couple of years' exams have been a little bit easier, and it's meant that an A plus is like 93% and above. But we're going to hang out for a little while, see who shows up, and then maybe answer some rapid fire questions, talk about some of the finer things about what needs to be done on the exam to do as well as possible. And then I'll have to go to work because it's like 7:20. I want to be at work just after 8. It's about a 25-minute drive. And then I've got to help my students who are going to be very nervous, anxious, and asking a lot of last-minute questions that will hopefully mean that they make no mistakes on the exam, but they'll probably make a few mistakes. So we have a couple of people here. That is exciting. That's more than potentially expected. Some of the main things that I want to talk about in the lead up to your exams, and if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I'll see them as they pop up. Going into the exam today starts now. Like before the exam, there's a lot of things you can do in the lead up to that exam that are going to help you go in calmer, have your brain thinking more rationally, and therefore put you in the best frame of mind to be able to tackle the questions and not fall for VCAR's tricks. Because at the end of the day, VCAR wants to trick students because they're trying to separate the top students from the students who are kind of in the middle, because everything's on a bell curve, and they want to make sure that the students who are getting that 50 are the best students, and the students who are not getting the 50 maybe are doing a little bit less in certain areas. So what I mean by that starts now is at 7:20 in the morning, you've got 4.5 hours until you are inside starting reading time for your exam. There's a lot of things that you could be doing in that time to make sure that you are as ready to go as possible. Part of that is eating a good breakfast. This is a weird exam time because it's right when I'd be eating lunch in that like 2 and a bit hour band. So either have a late breakfast or an early lunch that is something really good that isn't going to make you feel lethargic or crap when you're going into the exam. Something quite like nice and healthy is going to be great. What I really recommend for anyone is get some exercise going between now and then. You might not be an exercise person, but getting some fresh air, going for a walk, going for a jog, doing like lifting some weights quickly, it's going to get your blood pumping. It's going to get your neurons firing in your brain. You're going to be thinking clearer and quicker during that exam. You'll be surprised the impact that it has. It's kind of like become a ritual for me now that before an exam or a job interview, I'll always go for a run beforehand because it helps me think more clearly. Then you're probably cramming at the moment. You're probably planning to cram up until the exam. Stop cramming about an hour before the exam because anything in that last hour is not going to help you. You might read over some notes and stuff in that time. That's totally fine. But in that last hour, try and relax. Talk to your friends. Talk about anything else, because what often happens when you're trying to cram in that last hour, you start seeing the things you're not confident in, overthinking them, stressing about them, and then forgetting some of the easy stuff or getting all worked up and not knowing what to do when you get into that exam. So that is in the lead up to that. Avoid people who stress you out. We all know the other students who get really highly strung before exams. Yes, on a normal day, you would want to support them. But if their stress stresses you out, avoid them like the plague, because you want to keep yourself as regulated and as calm as possible. So when you go in, you are going to smash it. Then once you get to that exam, a few major tips that I have is use your reading time really well. So what I mean is in your reading time, skip straight to section B to start with and read through all the questions and just quickly in your head, think about how you're going to answer those questions. Look at the mark allocation, look at what wording is in the question, look at what task word that it is. E.g., if it says identify, you just have to say what it is. If it's describe, you give a little bit more detail about it. If it's defined, it's often a 2-mark question that is going to mean that you need to give a definition that's got basically 2 key points in it. If it's an explain question, you've got to go through the steps of how it leads to that endpoint. Any explain question in economics is normally explain how this thing impacts on this thing. Often what that means is you describe the change in that factor, then you normally link that factor to the components of aggregate demand or aggregate supply, and then talk about how it impacts aggregate demand or aggregate supply overall. Then, so you're going to go through the short answer, read all of those, check the mark allocations, make sure you're feeling confident for all of that. And then what I really mean is what I think you should do for most of reading time is go back to the multiple choice and read through them all and answer as many as you can in your head. Because if you do that, that's going to save so much time when you get into the actual exam, because you're going to be able to circle the answers really, really quickly and get straight on to having 2 hours to do 65 marks of short answer. Multiple choice is tricky though. So one of my aims today, and one thing that I always try and do, is while you're doing the exam, I get the exam about 45 minutes after you've started. I always try and answer all the multiple choice questions and put out a video by the end of the exam with the answers. Historically, I usually get at least one wrong because VCA are jerks and they use some tricky wording, or in the heat of answering it quickly, you can make silly little mistakes. So what I really recommend is in the multiple choice, there are a few things that can help you do as well as possible. The first and simplest one is if you know any answer is 100% incorrect, cross it out. There are some that are going to be really clear that there's two answers that are not right. And then worst case scenario, you've got a 50-50 shot at getting the answer correct. Next up in multiple choice, it's really, really important that you are highlighting, circling, or underlining the key terms in those questions. What that means is, so VCA likes to ask things like, which of the following is least likely to increase? And that's really confusing wording, because all that really means is which of the following would decrease whatever the concept is. So make sure you look at those directional words and kind of really, if you need to, write a small little thing of what it's actually asking. They also like to ask which of the following has a different effect from the others. When that's the case, use up and down arrows next to the responses to work out which one is different. Sometimes you don't even need to know that the answer is definitely correct. You might just work out that 3 have something in common. And if 3 have something in common, that means the other one is the odd one out, and therefore it is going to be the most correct. Other things with the multiple choice is that you are going to have to do some math. You're potentially going to have to do some supply demand type questions. Draw it out or do all the working out by the side of the question. If you get supply and demand type questions, which is like, if the price of product X goes down and it leads to a favorable shift in product Y, draw that situation and give names to the products. Try and work out what those products would be. Are they complements? Are they substitutes? Test that. See, are they bread and butter? Are they Coke and Pepsi? Because if you can work that out, you won't make silly mistakes. And you don't want to make silly mistakes in the multiple choice, because last year, one multiple choice question could literally be the difference between getting a mid 40 and a high 30. So making those really specific efforts to not make those mistakes are going to do you really, really well. Other things in the short answer. So some really, really important things at the moment, if you want to seem incredibly smart. The most recent cash rate is 2.85% as of November. We consider that to be less expansionary or slightly contractionary. We've also got the budget deficit, which the most recent Labor budget deficit is a $36.9 billion deficit, which is less expansionary than the previous deficit. We have inflation is at 7.3%, which is far above the target range of 2 to 3% on average over time. We have unemployment, which is 3.5%, which is below the goal range. And we have we've also got this goal of strong sustainable economic growth, which real GDP growth is about 3.6%. At the moment, none of the goals are being achieved because inflation is too high, because all of the goals have in the definition without unnecessary inflationary pressure. Because of that inflationary pressure, none of those goals are being achieved, and therefore you should say what the percentages are, but then mention that inflation is 7.3%. That's considered unacceptable inflationary pressure, and therefore that goal is not being achieved. Then, what else have we got? We've got automatic and discretionary stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers happen with no government intervention or interference. It is just the total amount of tax revenue received or welfare paid or outlaid without the government doing anything. So as economic activity rises, less people are unemployed, therefore they are earning more income or moving into higher tax brackets, and therefore they're paying more tax and the government's getting more tax revenue. At the same time, as unemployment falls, the government is paying out less welfare revenues and therefore welfare outlays, and therefore outlays are falling. This is going to work counter-cyclically to move us away from that expansion and into a contraction of the business cycle. Then discretionary stabilizers are any deliberate change the government has made. So changes to tax rates, infrastructure projects, changes to welfare, anything like that is a discretionary stabilizer that you can use as an example. Then for aggregate supply side policies, if you need a welfare reform, the current childcare subsidies or increases to childcare subsidies is a great example, because it gets more people willing to go back to the workforce as the cost of childcare has decreased, makes people more motivated to work or rejoin the labor force. Tax reform, you can talk about the low middle income tax offset of either $1,080 or the extra $420 that was added to it this year. That increases household disposable income as they get more tax back in their tax return. Also means their discretionary income's raised as they have more spending money available to purchase goods and services. They're a lot of the main tips that I have at the moment. Research and development may not lead to increase in productivity. Skilled migration is really great at increasing our productive capacity and filling skill shortages. However, some of that income may be sent overseas. We are in a current account surplus because of the strength of our trade balance at the moment. Commodity prices are incredibly high, but commodities are inelastic in demand, and therefore we have been getting a whole lot of export credits. This is also the reason why our terms of trade is so high. It's at about 147, which means that on average we are receiving more for our exports than we are paying for our imports. I think these are a lot of tips. I've got about 5 more minutes before I have to duck off. Send me any questions that you have last minute and I'll try and rapid fire answer them. And then it will be all on you to be as ready as possible for this exam. I'm going to spin this globe in the background that is made of Lego while I wait for anything to come through. So yeah, China is one of the biggest reasons for our current account surplus and trade surplus at the moment. Oh, structural factors for the current account. With the current account and structural factors are all about long-term or aggregate supply-based reasons why we have had a current account deficit in the past. At the moment, we have a surplus, and the reasons for that are the record low interest rates worldwide over the last 2 years, which has meant we've got less debits going out as interest repayments in net primary incomes. But also, we've had an increase in savings in Australia. And historically, we've had really weak savings in Australia, but a lot of people saved a lot of money during COVID, and therefore we've got more savings to use compared to previous periods. And therefore, we're not having to borrow as much from overseas. We've got less interest burden. So we've got asked here, do we have to know the terms of trade like the figure? No, you just need to understand that the terms of trade is high and what that means. So if the terms of trade is high, it means that on average, we're receiving more for our exports compared to what we're paying for our imports or relative to. And with the terms of trade, we assume that quantities are constant or ceteris paribus. Therefore, if the terms of trade is higher, we are getting more export credits or more export injections and less import debits or leakages. What's the best way to approach and answer an extended response? So often there's like 8-mark questions in these exams. This is great. This is now answering 2 questions at once. Often if there's an 8-mark question, it's been about automatic discretionary stabilizers, it's been about transmission mechanisms, or it's been about aggregate demand policies. If you get a question that says aggregate demand policies, it means talk about budgetary policy and monetary policy. If you get a transmission mechanisms one, it's just talking about 2 transmission mechanisms, and BCARs always let you talk about whichever ones you need to talk about or want to talk about. Then if it is the automatic discretionary stabilizers one, that's what it was last year. It's unlikely to be that again, but it's just talking about how both operate in whatever situation they have given you. With any of the 8-mark questions, often you can break them down into 2 4-mark questions or multiple smaller questions. And I recommend doing that and then just answering them in order to make sure you're getting as many marks as possible. We've got, would a firm decreasing supply leading to a shortage, causing consumers to bid up prices, cause cost push or demand pull inflationary pressures? So if a firm decreasing supply leads to a shortage, well, anytime there's a shortage, that is going to cause demand pull inflationary pressures. So if a firm's decreased supply because of, it depends what the reason is. Like if a firm's just decreasing supply because of potentially decreased, or whatever we could have, like often in that instance, there's potentially going to be cost push inflation, because if there's an unfavorable shift in supply, chances are it's from unfavorable supply conditions, and that's going to push up prices from a supply point of view, and that's going to be passed on to consumers. There'll be a mix of both though. What does overseas growth mean for our exchange rate? Overseas growth means there's going to be more demand for our exports, especially if China is growing at a rapid pace. They're going to want more of our exports, and therefore we are going to have more demand for our exports, more demand for the Australian dollar, and that's going to put upward pressure on the exchange rate. The trade balance versus the terms of trade. The trade balance is just our imports versus our exports. So how much we're exporting versus how much we're importing. The terms of trade is on average how much we are receiving for our exports in terms of price relative to what we're paying for imports in terms of price. How often should I define key terms? Like, do I need to keep defining terms like AD and AS? If you have an umbrella of questions, like so for A, B, C, D, etc., you normally just need to define something in the first part of it, and then you can keep just referring to it after that. I still recommend in most cases describing things to make it really clear what it is. One of the main pieces of advice I've given to students over the years is assume the person marking your exam is an idiot. You need to spell things out for them. You don't want them to have to go looking for marks. You want them to just be like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about, and then that is fine. Would you talk about the terms of trade when talking about the trade balance? It would depend on the question. If you just have a current account question about the trade balance, you wouldn't talk about the terms of trade. If you had a terms of trade question that talks about how it impacts the current account, you would talk about how then that would impact the trade balance, because if the terms of trade improves, we're going to be receiving more on average for our exports compared to imports. That means more export credits coming in, which is going to be favorable for our trade balance. All right, I think that is going to wrap things up for now because I need to get going to work. I hope that you are all feeling as confident as possible, and that you smash the exam today. If you have any questions after the exam, feel free to send me an email or a comment somewhere. I'll try and get the multiple choice answers out as correct as possible. And just one quick last question is, how is the underlying budget deficit calculated? Are future funds earnings still subtracted? Yes, with the underlying budget balance, it's essentially government receipts or government revenues, and you take away anything else. You take away outlays and you take away anything that won't have a direct impact on the economy. So you remove future funds earnings because they're basically stuck in an account that you can't access until it gets to the end of the period where you can access it. Often they're long-term savings accounts. So although it will be earning money and that is a revenue, you can't use that revenue. Therefore, it is subtracted. So underlying budget balance is essentially revenues take away everything else if you get given that information. I hope that I've been able to help you this morning. I hope that you're feeling confident. I hope that you smash the exam. I'd love to hear how you go. And yeah, after today, you don't have to worry about economics ever again unless you study it next year at university. Have a wonderful day. Good luck and get outside, get some fresh air. See you later. Bye.